We were on a visit earlier this week, and we had the chance to reflect a little, but also to share one aspect of our approach to ministry, why we do ministry a certain way. And part of the conversation dealt with how we handle children, and especially when they're being naughty or just having an off night. And if you haven't figured out yet, for Melissa and I, one aspect of our ministry, or another aspect of our ministry, that we try to encourage, whether certainly in the kids, but also in adults, is to ask questions. That it is okay if you have questions. Questions about Jesus, questions about heaven, questions about Christianity, whatever. Part of this is I like to learn, and I learn by asking questions, so it's fair if other people ask questions too. The other part, which maybe is even more important though, is I know that you have doubts and questions and things concerning this faith that we try to follow. I know you have doubts. I know you have questions. I know you have concerns about Christianity. I know that these things exist. And to tell you the truth, I do too. Melissa and I, we both have aspects of faith that are hard to wrestle with. We have aspects of faith and parts of the Bible that we read that it's hard to digest or to understand. Maybe things that we'd rather not digest or understand. And I share this to encourage you. Just to encourage that you're not alone in your doubts, in your questions, that why is this the way it is? You're not alone in those thoughts. But also I share because I think it's okay. It's an okay thing, not to give us justification, but because we serve a God who is hugely capable of handling my doubts and your questions and our apprehensions about him. We serve a God who is very able to handle anything that we can throw at him. We might doubt his existence. He can handle it. We might question why this is happening this way. He can handle it. Whatever we do, whatever we throw at him, whatever doubts we might have, God is able to handle those things. And so I want to affirm in you. I want to affirm that doubts about God, they happen for many reasons. You might have doubts about God. I might have doubts about God for a lot of reasons. One might be our circumstances. We might be in a place that brings about some doubts. Sometimes death brings doubts. Death of our friend, death of our family member, why they were taken, when they were, or how, or those kinds of things. Death might bring up some doubts. Some of us go through different health circumstances that cause doubts in our lives. There is one of our after-school kids, his mom she thought she had cancer. And some of her original tests, the thought was she was maybe towards stage 3 cancer, but it ended up not being that. I asked Adam, he gave me permission. I asked Adam, when you were going through your cancer things, did you have doubts? And he said, absolutely, especially during his first diagnosis. He had a lot of doubts. Sometimes health brings up different doubts in us. For other circumstances, we as Christians, sometimes we can be jerks. We can be just downright nasty. In case you didn't know, hopefully that's not you. I try not to let it be me. But we can be jerks, and occasionally people don't come to church and they have doubts about Christ, doubts about faith, doubts about the church, because there were Christians who were mean and nasty to them. Another reason that people have doubts, one of the more common questions, if you meet someone who they claim to be an atheist or an agnostic, and if you ask them why, if there's all of this suffering in the world, how could God exist? How could God exist? He must not exist because there's all this suffering. Now, maybe you identify with some of those things that I said. Maybe some of your doubts, some of your struggles of faith, some of the things that you've wrestled with are stemming from those issues. Maybe you have doubts because of other things. And I know it's a little bit of a tangent, but I just want to be honest. I want to be honest with this conversation because it's one that Satan uses to isolate people, to discourage people. And so why not shine some light on this issue where Satan tries to put darkness there? Now, this sermon is not going to be one where you have doubts about X, Y, and Z, and I answer those. I try to answer those. It's not that kind of sermon, so I apologize. I'll just let you know now. But to encourage that just because you have doubts does not mean you're in sin. Just because you have doubts does not mean you are alone. Now, if you are one who you never have questions, you never have doubts, I'm going to assume one of maybe a couple few things about you. The first thing I'll assume is that you have a rock solid, very strong faith. And that's great. That's great. Your faith is probably more rock solid than mine. Because as I mentioned, I have doubts about different things. And I don't say that flippantly. That is a wonderful, wonderful thing if you are one who you never question. You never have any doubts. Excellent. So that would be the first thing I would assume. If that's not you, if you never have questions, you never have doubts, but that's not you, I'm going to make an assumption about your faith. And it's your faith as somewhere between dying and dead. Your faith is somewhere between moldy, crusty, dirty, dormant, and non-existent. The reason I say that, a vibrant, growing faith is one where God speaks to us and he reveals things to us about ourselves, about the culture around us, and usually those things are not easy to deal with. They're not easy to deal with. Those of us who are Christians, those of us who are growing in our faith, the ways that God encourages us usually is not, you need to stop murdering people. You need to turn in your guns and your swords and your grenades and your weapons. You need to stop doing these things. For most people who are on the steady path of growing in their faith, God doesn't usually encourage them to stop trafficking people. Because usually they're not murdering people. They're not trafficking people. They're not doing those things. But where God does encourage most who are growing in their faith is to be more forgiving, or more humble, or more gracious with other people. In a world full of people who brag and they hold grudges, when God encourages us to go against the grain, it creates disconnects. It creates problems. It creates doubts. And as God invites us to more with himself, as God invites us to greater fellowship, deeper intimacy, we might look around in our time, in our relationship with God, and we might find we are in deep water, and we might doubt our ability to swim. But we need not doubt, because he is the life preserver. He is the one who holds us. It's not on us to learn how to swim anyway. It's on the Lord who will carry us through those deep waters. We're not alone. You and I are not alone in the doubts that we might have. Doubt is shown throughout the Bible. Elijah, the prophet Elijah, had some doubts. He had this great mountaintop experience where literally fire fell from heaven. And then he learned there was a hit put out on him. Jezebel said, go get him. So he ran for his life. Literally ran for his life. And he doubted. He saw the power of God in front of him. Fire coming from heaven. But he doubted. We find in the Psalms a man after God's own heart, David, who wrote many of the Psalms, his doubt on full display. His doubt on full display as he struggled. Yet God knew him well, called him a man after his own heart. In the New Testament, there are folks who have doubts as well. One of them is John the Baptist. And as I mentioned before, sometimes life's circumstances bring about doubts. For John the Baptist, we didn't cover it in Matthew, but we were talking about Luke. But Matthew 11:2, John the Baptist is in jail. Now, I've never been incarcerated. I've visited jail. But sometimes folks in jail have doubts about all kinds of different things. The circumstances help bring those things about. John the Baptist, he had some doubts. So this is why he sent his disciples to talk to Jesus. Now, a couple things for background on John the Baptist. If you look at verse 28 of the scripture from today, it says, I say to you, among those born of women, there is no one greater than John. And under the old covenant, John is the greatest. Jesus said John's the greatest under the old covenant. Secondly, you don't have to flip back there, but in Luke chapter 1, verses 41 and 44, John's mother Elizabeth is pregnant with him. And it says her relative Mary came to visit her. Mary, while she was pregnant with Jesus. And when Mary came in the room, John the Baptist leaped in Elizabeth's womb. Leaped in her womb. That was a God-given awareness of who Jesus was. Later, as John baptized Jesus and he saw the Spirit descend like a dove, he heard the voice of God saying, this is my son, I'm proud of him. I'm well pleased. John knew who Jesus was, maybe better than most on earth. But he still wrestled with some doubts. John the Baptist knew Jesus far more than we might. He could walk up to Jesus and hug him, give him a high five, have a secret handshake. They were relatives. He knew Jesus, but he still had doubts. So, John the Baptist, he sends his disciples, verse 19, verse 20, and says, are you the one? Are you the guy we've all been waiting for? Now, Jesus, in true Jesus fashion, he doesn't say, yeah, it's me. Or he doesn't say, no, it's not. He doesn't give just a simple answer. Instead, he says, open your eyes. Open your eyes. Verse 22. And he answered and said to them, go and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, the poor have the gospel preached to them. Well, that's awesome. That's awesome. But to understand, you have to go a little bit deeper. If you're taking notes, we're not going to flip there, but if you're taking notes, write down Isaiah 29. Isaiah 29, verses 18 and 19. Also, chapter 35, verses 5 and 6. And then chapter 61, verse 1, all in Isaiah. Isaiah 35, 5 and 6, it says, "Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will shout for joy. For waters will break forth in the wilderness and streams in the Arabah." It's so cool because these scriptures from Isaiah, they were associated with a time of coming prosperity, of longing and wanting, a time of deliverance. And so Jesus answers John's disciples by telling them, that time is now, buddy. That time is happening right now. Look around you. Look around you. Because Jesus could say, "I'm the guy," and that would have been enough. But look around you. What do you see? You see blind people seeing. You see deaf people getting up and walking. You see deaf people hearing. Jesus is so gracious that he doesn't just tell John's disciples in verse 22, but verse 21, at that very time he cured many people of diseases. At that very time he gave sight to many who were blind. At that time. So his disciples, John's disciples, are going back to him and he says, "Did you talk to him?" "Oh, yeah." "What did he say?" He didn't say yes, but he showed us. You remember that one guy, John, who was blind? He can see. Do you remember that one guy that we saw? I think you might have baptized him. He was deaf. Yeah, I remember him. He can hear. Jesus cured him. Literally in front of us. Literally in front of us. They could say that Jesus told us blank, but he did it. He did it. The long-awaited time of Jesus continuing, the long-awaited time was being fulfilled literally in front of them. Literally in front of them. Now, he was directing that at John the Baptist's disciples. But if you keep going, verse 24, and following, Jesus, he turns to the crowd, verse 24 says. And he's speaking about John. But he's talking to the crowd now. And he quotes, in verse 27, he quotes the book of Malachi, last book in the Old Testament. Chapter 3, verse 1. "Behold, I send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you." Now, some of the people in the crowd, they would have missed it. They wouldn't have known what that meant. But others in the crowd, they would have realized Jesus is talking about blind people seeing. Jesus is talking about deaf people hearing, the poor having the gospel preached to them. Jesus is talking about this messenger going before, and they would have realized, oh, this is different. Oh, this is not like anything we've ever seen before. Because it's not. Jesus was the Messiah. There's no Messiah besides him. And so what he's saying, some would have missed it. But some would have said, oh, I better wake up. I better realize what is being presented here. What is being presented here? Now, later, Jesus, he's presenting this information and he's calling them out on their expectations. What are they expecting? And the expectations for the Messiah during this time, maybe even for John himself, was this military leader, this regal ruler. They were not expecting a servant king. They were not expecting a suffering king. And in verse 26 it says, "What did you go out to see?" Jesus is talking to them. "Did you go out to see a prophet? Yes, you did." Yes. And I say more than just a prophet. Throughout the Gospels, many people had certain expectations. Certainly, they had certain expectations. And Jesus, he showed and told. Not only did he tell, but he showed who and what he was. But a lot of people missed it. A lot of people missed it. Because Jesus never said very plainly, as folks wanted him to, "Yep, I'm the Messiah, come follow me. I'm the one who was promised a long time ago." But Jesus did say, what's going on? Blind people are hearing. The dead are being raised. The poor are having the gospel preached to them. All these things are happening. But people missed it because they were expecting something else. When I used to live in Indiana, I have a good friend that I met, and we bonded because my girlfriend was in South Dakota, and her boyfriend was in Russia. I couldn't go see my girlfriend, so it felt like she was in Russia, except I could call her. It was a little bit easier to call South Dakota than Russia. But I was telling my friend of how, I would love some soul food, a nice, good soul food meal. And she cooked one for me. Very gracious, and it was great. But my understanding of soul food was rooted back when I was 11 years old, 12 years old, going to church with my mom. And after church, we would go to some, 85-year-old woman's house who cooked fried chicken and collard greens and banana pudding and candied yams and the whole bit. So that's what I was thinking of soul food. So what's what I was expecting of soul food. So when my friend cooked for me, I missed it. I was expecting something else. And so in the moment, didn't realize the goodness of what was in front of me. And later I made some kind of comment and she called me out on it. She said, "What do you think I just did? What do you think I just did?" And it hurt her. My expectations were something else, were somewhere else, so I missed what was in front of me. Jesus showed himself to be the Messiah, but people missed it because they were expecting someone else. They're expecting something else. Now, earlier I mentioned some reasons why people have doubts concerning the Lord and the things of the Lord, and one that I didn't mention, but on purpose, is the reason of unmet expectations. Sometimes people have expectations, and when they're not met, doubts come about. Across Mason City today, across the United States, there are many people who they slept in instead of going to church. Across Mason City, across the United States, there's a lot of people who said, "I'm never going back in that church." And the reason why is because they went once upon a time. They used to go, and they had expectations of how people should be. They had expectations of being welcomed warmly. But instead, we showed our humanity, and we might have been jerks. Or we may not have welcomed them. We may not have said, "I'm so glad you're here. Jesus loves you and so do I." They were forced to sit by themselves. They were forced to be ridiculed. They were expecting to be welcomed, and they weren't. And so their unmet expectations created some doubts. Other times, people, they have started praying, and they've gone to church, they've gone to Bible study with the hopes that God would solve all of their problems. Sometimes folks, they started going because their marriage is on the rocks. They started going because their kids are hellions. They started going and saying, well, I'm going to go to Bible study. And God will solve all my problems. And when their mom died, or their husband left them, or their circumstances did not improve, they blamed Jesus, they blamed the church, and they left. That's not fair. It's not fair, and it doesn't make a ton of sense. Listen up, because this is important. God is not a slot machine. God is not a slot machine where we put in time, where we put in a few bucks in the offering plate, and out comes blessings and wealth. Christianity is not a transaction where we spend some time volunteering or being nice to people or kissing up to the captains, and then we get to go to heaven. It's not that kind of thing. Jesus presents himself in the Gospels, and the rest of the biblical record speaks to what the life of Christ looks like. God takes the first step to show who he is in the Old Testament as he shows his love. And then in the New Testament, God shows who he is by sending his son to live amongst a bunch of rejecting no good nothings who were expecting someone else, so he missed him. God took the step to show who he is and to open the door for invitation and redemption. And we submit our hearts to God's first step. Now, as I mentioned, Jesus, he puts it out there who he is. The blind can see, and the deaf can hear, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. Jesus puts it out there who he is. And if you start in verse 30, the Pharisees and the lawyers rejected God's purpose for themselves. Instead of trusting what Jesus says, instead of trusting their eyes, they knew better. But instead of trusting their eyes and what they could see, they chose to reject. Jesus commands a response. Jesus compels a response. It compelled a response in the Pharisees. The actions and works of Christ compelled a response in them. John sent his disciples to ask Jesus, are you the one? And Jesus shares what's going on. Jesus' actions compel a response from John the Baptist and his disciples. Would he choose to say, yeah, he is the one, and I'm going to submit my life to that? Or is he going to say it's not good enough, and I'll reject like the Pharisees? Just as Jesus compels a response in the Pharisees and John the Baptist, Jesus compels a response in you and in me as well. I mentioned how everyone at one point or another has different doubts, but the challenge is not to stay in a doubting state of mind, but to press in and to investigate. There is a man named Lee Strobel. Lee Strobel is an author. He wrote a book called The Case for Christ, The Case for Faith. He wrote some other books as well. And at one point, Lee Strobel was an atheist. He was an atheist, and his wife came to Christ. And so, like the good husband that he wasn't, he said, you know what? My wife came to Christ. I'm going to prove her wrong. This Christ thing is a joke. And so I'm going to do some research and some investigating, and I'm going to prove my wife is wasting her time. Husband of the year. And as he's researching, as he's investigating, because he had some severe doubts, he found Jesus to be real, and he submitted his life to Christ. He had doubts, but when pressed and found Jesus to be real, he had to respond. He had to respond. It is not wrong to have doubts, but to let those doubts push us into greater faith is the better way. Once, while preaching on the subject of doubt, Pastor Ray Pritchard, he offered a few ways to move from doubt to faith. And two of them he suggested were to act on your faith, not your doubts. Act on your faith and not your doubts. And the other one was to doubt your doubts, not your faith. To doubt your doubts and not your faith. For those of you who haven't read it or haven't read it in a while, Hebrews 11 might be one of the best chapters in the Bible. It is the tale of some of the heroes of the faith. And all of these people mentioned, they had doubts of many, many layers and levels. But they acted on their faith and not on their doubts. They may not have had all of the answers. They may not have had any of the answers. But they did not let that stop them. Pertaining to doubting our doubts, not our faith, Pritchard, he says, this simply means that you should not cast away your faith simply because you are in the deep valley of darkness. You shouldn't cast away your faith simply because you are in the valley of darkness. When you find yourself in that valley where all is uncertain and you are tempted to give in to your doubts, fears, and worries, keep walking. Just keep walking. When we find ourselves in deep, dark places here, we don't stay there. We keep walking towards the light. And when we have doubts, Pastor Pritchard says, the deep valley of darkness where we don't know what's going on. We can't tell left from right. Everything is just a struggle and we are doubting. Keep going. Keep going. I would add on to his challenge, when we have doubts, why does faith have to be not true? Why can't our doubts be not true? Doubt our doubts, not our faith. Instead of God being untrue, maybe doubts are untrue. As we get ready to conclude, I recognize, as I said, I probably didn't solve any of your doubts. Probably didn't answer any of your issues. But I want to help you realize you're not in sin. You're not in sin. I hope you realize and feel comforted that you are not alone. You're not alone. From Noah to Abraham to Elijah to even John the Baptist, many in the Bible had doubts. Just as you and just as me. John had the same opportunity that you and I do to go straight to Christ. To go straight to Christ. When we do have doubts, Jesus does not cast us out as an unbelieving, horrendous sinner. He embraces us. He speaks to our souls. He lets us know, yes, you might have doubts, but I am the truth. Jesus is the truth to the doubts that you and I have. Jesus is the truth to the questions and the struggles that you and I might have. Homiletically speaking, you're not supposed to introduce new ideas to conclude, but if you would, everyone flip to 2 Corinthians chapter 3. 2 Corinthians chapter 3. And some of you, you're going to want to underline this or highlight or whatever you do. Put stars or hearts in your Bible around it. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 16 through 18. In the ESV it says, but when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Verse 18, and we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image, from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 16 through 18. Some of you might need to underline that. All of us need to walk under that, need to embrace that. That is the gospel. Jesus has come to set us free, to forgive our sins, to redeem our souls, to set us free. To set us free from shame, to set us free from doubt, to set us free from the things that drag us down. Doubts might still come, but we have access to the truth. Doubts come because of something we might be unsure of. We have access to the truth. We can and we should cling to the cornerstone of the cross of Christ, because truth starts there. Truth starts there. It is the object of our faith and the most entirely sure thing in the entire universe, the death and resurrection of Christ. It may not get rid of your doubts. It may not solve all your problems. But as the song says, when the howling storms of doubt and fear assail, we speak truth to those. We fall under the freedom that Christ brings, taking us from glory to glory. Everyone stand.